The old cemetery on the outskirts of Blackwood, Georgia, was a place of quiet reverence. It wasn't meticulously manicured like those in the city, but its charm lay in its gentle neglect, moss draped from ancient oaks, their gnarled branches casting a dappled light over the weathered headstones. The air, thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, was usually broken only by the chirping of crickets or the distant call of a hawk. Today, however, that peace was shattered. A rusty pickup truck, its tires kicking up a cloud of red dust, skidded to a stop near the back fence. Out of it piled 3 young men, their laughter loud and coarse, a jarring intrusion on the sacred silence. They carried cans of cheap beer, their movements sloppy and disrespectful. Their names were lost to the anonymity of their cruelty, just 3 faces in a crowd of ignorance. But their actions would forever brand them. They were looking for a good time, a few cheap thrills, and a way to prove their bravado to each other. They'd been told a story, a vile joke, about an old grave in this section of the cemetery, and they'd come to see for themselves. The object of their mockery was a simple headstone, old and worn, but immaculately cared for. The grass around it was trimmed, a small vase held a fresh bouquet of hydrangeas, and a small, faded American flag was staked next to it. The inscription read, Eleanor Vance, 1925 to 2010, a life of grace, a heart of service. Below her name was a smaller, more recent edition, a small engraving of a silver star with 5 points. Here it is, one of them said, his voice a mocking imitation of a Southern preacher. The famous Eleanor Vance. So important they put a star on her grave. The other 2 snickered, and one of them, the largest and most brutish, kicked at the base of the headstone. A crack spidered across the worn granite. The 3rd man took out his phone, a sinister smile on his face, and began to record. "Say something for the camera, boys," he said, his voice a sickening mix of triumph and malice. "Let the whole world know what we think of her and her fancy star. I think she'd make a great chew toy for a dog." The large one sneered, and with a grunt, he picked up a can of beer and poured it over the small bouquet of flowers. The other 2 men hooted with laughter, their shadows long and grotesque in the fading light far across the cemetery. An old black man named Walter sat on a bench, tending to his wife's grave. He had watched the truck arrive, his heart sinking with a terrible premonition. He knew exactly which grave they were desecrating. Eleanor Vance had been his friend, a woman of such quiet strength and profound dignity that her memory alone was a comfort. Her death had left a hole in the community, a void filled by the respect and love she had earned from everyone who knew her. The silver star on her headstone wasn't just a simple decoration. It was a tribute from someone who understood the depth of her service. Walter, however, was old and weary. His knees ached, and his heart was filled with a deep, impotent rage. He felt a helpless tremor run through his body. He wanted to do something, to shout, to make them stop, but he knew the futility of it. They would only mock him. He clenched his fists, his knuckles white, and bowed his head in a silent prayer for a justice he didn't believe would come. The young men were just beginning to lose interest, their cruelty a fleeting amusement, when a new sound pierced the afternoon stillness. It wasn't a truck, but something with a deeper, more powerful rumble. A sleek, black military-style SUV, its windows tinted. turned off the main road and glided to a silent halt just behind the pickup truck. The men, startled, turned. A sense of unease rippled through them. The vehicle was completely out of place. Too polished and menacing for this small town. The driver's side door opened, and a man emerged. He was tall, powerfully built, and dressed in a perfectly tailored dark suit. His shoulders were broad, his posture as straight as a steel rod. He moved with the quiet authority of a predator, every step deliberate and precise. He was a man accustomed to commanding respect, and he didn't need to say a word to get it. His face, etched with a lifetime of discipline and resolve, was a deep, rich ebony, and his eyes, as dark and piercing as a winter night, scanned the scene. They landed on the three young men, their cruel laughter now replaced with a nervous silence. Then, his gaze dropped to the defiled headstone. The general's name was Marcus Thorne. He had arrived in Blackwood for a private and personal matter. A pilgrimage he made once a year, a solemn vow he had kept for more than 2 decades. He had been planning to arrive a day earlier, but a sudden, urgent meeting at the Pentagon had delayed him. He had driven all night, the miles blurring into a single, determined pursuit of a promise. He had planned to arrive at dawn, to be the first one to lay fresh flowers on her grave, but now, his personal tribute was being desecrated. The sight of the overturned flowers, the spilled beer, and the fresh crack in the granite filled him with a cold, righteous fury. It was a fury he had learned to harness, to control, but it was there. A simmering fire in his gut, Marcus walked toward them, his steps silent, his presence a heavy weight in the air. The young men, so brazen just moments before, began to shrink under his gaze. The leader, the one who had kicked the headstone, tried to regain his swagger. "Can we help you, old man?" he asked, his voice wavering slightly. Marcus stopped a few feet from them, his hands at his sides. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't need to. His tone was as hard as the granite they had defiled. "You three have 2 choices," he said. His voice a low, resonant rumble. "You can get back in your truck, drive away, and hope to God I never see your faces again. Or, you can stand here and let me tell you what you've just done." The young men exchanged nervous glances. They were outmatched, and they knew it. The sheer force of this man's presence was terrifying. He didn't have to threaten them. His very existence was a threat. The bully, sensing his control slipping, tried to puff out his chest. "We ain't scared of you," he bluffed. "We'll do whatever we want." Marcus took a step closer, and a deep-seated fear finally gripped the young men. He wasn't a man to be trifled with. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity and had fought to preserve the best. "I'm not a police officer," Marcus said, his voice dropping another octave. "And I'm not a civilian. What you did here today is a federal offense, a desecration of a grave on hallowed ground. But more than that, it's a personal insult to a woman who deserves your reverence, not your ridicule." He glanced down at the small headstone. The sight of the cracked granite sent a fresh wave of cold fury through him. He looked back up at them, his eyes glinting with a dangerous light. "Do you know who Eleanor Vance was?" he asked. They shook their heads, their bravado completely evaporated. They were just boys now, pathetic and small. "She was a cook," Marcus began, his voice taking on a new cadence, a sound of profound respect. During the Korean War, she was a volunteer. She didn't have a uniform or a rank, but she served our troops. She worked in the field hospitals, bringing them hot meals, a kind word, and a sense of home when they were a world away. She was there when the enemy was at the gate, when the bombs were falling, and when the blood ran thick on the ground. She was one of us. He paused, a flicker of emotion in his eyes. I was a boy then, a scared little corporal, not much older than you. I was sent to her kitchen, bleeding from a shrapnel wound. I was weak, afraid, and ready to give up. I thought I was going to die. But she looked at me, with the same grace, and the same quiet strength as the day she died. And she told me, son, you are not dead yet. Now eat your stew. You've got a long life ahead of you, and you're going to be a general someday. That day, she saved my life. The silence that followed was heavy and profound. The young men were staring at him, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. They had been mocking the grave of a woman who had served her country with a bravery that shamed their petty cruelty. They had been desecrating the memory of a woman who had given comfort to countless men in their darkest hours. And they had done it in the presence of a general. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of paper, a yellowed and faded photograph. It was a picture of him, a young, skinny corporal, standing next to a smiling Eleanor Vance in a field kitchen. He held it up for them to see. That star on her grave, he said, his voice now a simple, raw whisper. That's the star from my uniform. She gave me my life, and she gave me my purpose. I owe her everything. The young men looked at the photo, their eyes wide with a terrible realization. The general's name was whispered back and forth. They had heard of him, of course. Marcus Thorne was a name whispered in the hallowed halls of military lore, a name that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. He was a hero, a legend, a man who had led his troops through some of the most brutal conflicts in modern history. And now, they were standing in front of him, having desecrated the grave of the woman who was the source of his greatness. The leader of the group, his face ashen, took a shaky step forward. I'm sorry, sir, he stammered, his voice choked with shame and terror. We didn't know. You didn't know because you didn't care to know, Marcus said, his voice unwavering. You saw a black woman's grave, and you assumed it meant nothing. You assumed you had the right to mock a life that had more purpose and dignity in a single moment than you'll ever have in your entire lives. Marcus then turned his attention to the second man, the one with the phone. You were recording this, he said, his voice flat. The young man, his hand trembling, fumbled with the phone and held it out to him. Marcus took it, his strong fingers wrapped around the device like a vice. He opened the phone and with a single, practiced motion, he threw it to the ground and stomped on it, shattering the screen into 100 tiny pieces. The young man flinched, but he didn't dare say a word. Now listen to me, Marcus said, his voice a low growl. You will stay here. You will clean this grave. You will remove every single sign of your filth. You will replace the flowers. And you will not leave until this place is pristine. The three men nodded, their faces pale, their eyes filled with a dawning comprehension of the mistake they had made. They were not just facing an angry man. They were facing a general, a man who had seen the worst that humanity had to offer, and who had chosen to be better than it. His moral authority was absolute, his presence a stark and terrifying reminder of what honor truly meant. As the men began their grim work, Walter, the old man from across the cemetery, walked over, his face a mixture of awe and relief. "General Thorne," he said, his voice full of reverence. "I've been waiting for you." Marcus nodded, his eyes fixed on the three young men who were now scrubbing the headstone with their bare hands. "I had to handle a few things first," he said, the ghost of a smile on his face. The men worked for hours, their movements no longer swaggering and arrogant, but slow and meticulous. They scrubbed every inch of the headstone. They replanted the hydrangeas with the care of seasoned gardeners, and they even mended the crack with a small bit of clay they found nearby. They were not just cleaning a grave. They were atoning for a profound insult, a desecration of a sacred memory. When the sun began to set, the grave of Eleanor Vance was once again pristine. The headstone shone in the fading light, the new flowers were a vibrant splash of color, and the American flag stood tall and proud, a silent sentinel in the cooling air. The three young men stood at a distance, their hands dirty, their faces etched with a shame they had never known. Marcus walked over to the headstone and gently touched the polished surface. He stood there for a long time, in silent communion with the woman who had saved his life all those years ago. He was no longer a general, a man of power and authority. He was just a boy, paying his respects to the woman who had helped him become a man. He finally turned and looked at the three young men. "You will come back here every week," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "You will tend this grave. You will clean it, and you will make sure that no one ever again disrespects it. And if I find out you have not kept this promise, I will find you, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your lives regretting this day." He didn't need to say another word. They knew he meant it. They had looked into the eyes of a man who had seen a war, and they knew that he was a force of nature, a man who would never break his promise. They were no longer mockers, no longer a source of cruel laughter. They were guardians, a living testament to the power of a woman's grace and a general's honor. As the sun sank below the horizon, casting a final golden light over the quiet cemetery, Marcus Thorne got back into his car. He drove away, leaving behind a profound stillness, a sense of peace that had been restored by the power of a single man's authority, and the memory of a woman who had lived a life of quiet grace. The story of what happened at the cemetery spread through the town like wildfire. It was a story not just of justice, but of a quiet, powerful vindication. It was a story of a woman whose simple life had more meaning than a million moments of disrespect. It was a story of a general who came not to fight a battle, but to win a war for a woman he loved. And in that small southern town, in the old cemetery where the moss still hung from the trees, the grave of Eleanor Vance was no longer just a memory. It was a monument, a powerful and unwavering testament to the fact that honor, in the end, would always find a way to prevail.